Nigerian woman senator suspended after sexual assault. Allegation, a deep dive into gender inequality in African politics. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, your go-to source for comprehensive analysis and thought-provoking commentary on Africa's most pressing political and social issues. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today, we're diving deep into the recent suspension of Nigerian Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan after making serious allegations against Senate President Godswill Akpabio. What does this incident reveal about the state of gender equality in African politics? How does it compare to similar challenges across the continent? Stick with us as we break it down and discuss what needs to change for women in politics. In early March 2025, Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan of Nigeria's Kogi Central Senatorial District was suspended for 6 months by the Nigerian Senate. The official reasons cited included her alleged refusal to sit in her assigned seat, speaking without permission, and making abusive remarks about Senate leadership. This suspension entails the withdrawal of her allowances and security details, effectively barring her from her legislative duties during this period. The allegations and procedural controversy. Prior to her suspension, Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan accused Senate President Godswill Akpabio of sexual assault. However, the Senate's Ethics Committee dismissed her claims, citing procedural violations. They recommended her suspension not for the sexual assault accusation itself, but for alleged misconduct within the Senate chamber. Akpoti-Uduaghan has since criticized her suspension, stating that it violates principles of natural justice, fairness, and equity. She has also filed a lawsuit against Senate President Akpabio, seeking N$100 billion in damages. Public and legal reactions. The suspension has sparked significant public discourse. Atedo Peterside, founder of Stanbic IBTC Bank plc, condemned the action as illegal and disrespectful to Akpoti-Uduaghan's constituents. Legal experts, including Femi Falana, have labeled the suspension as legislative recklessness, calling for its immediate reversal. The Socioeconomic Rights and Accountability Project, SERAP, has also weighed in, urging the Senate to rescind the suspension, labeling it unlawful. They argue that the Senate should revise parliamentary procedures that unduly restrict senators' human rights. Gender dynamics and institutional response. This incident highlights the challenges women face in Nigerian politics. Akpoti-Uduaghan is one of only 4 women in the 109-seat Senate, underscoring the gender disparity in Nigerian politics. Her suspension, following her sexual assault allegations, raises concerns about sexism and the treatment of women within political institutions. A 2021 report by the Inter-Parliamentary Union, IPU, and the African Parliamentary Union, APU, revealed that 40% of women parliamentarians in Africa have experienced sexual harassment, and 23% have endured physical violence. The report suggests that these incidents are often perpetrated by male colleagues, particularly from rival parties. Comparative perspectives. Africa's struggle with gender-based violence in politics. The challenges faced by Akpoti-Uduaghan are not isolated. In 2019, Gambian beauty queen Fatou Jallow accused former President Yahya Jammeh of rape and sexual harassment, leading to her exile. Similarly, South African singer Jennifer Ferguson accused football administrator Danny Jordan of rape, sparking national debates on sexual violence and accountability. These cases, among others, shed light on the pervasive issue of gender-based violence and harassment in African political spheres. They underscore the urgent need for institutional reforms, robust legal frameworks, and cultural shifts to protect women and promote gender equality in politics. Looking ahead, towards a more inclusive and safer political environment. Addressing the systemic issues that allow such incidents to persist requires a multifaceted approach. 1. Institutional reforms. Parliaments and political bodies must implement strict codes of conduct, establish independent committees to handle allegations of misconduct, and ensure transparent investigations. 2. Legal frameworks. Strengthening laws that protect against sexual harassment and violence, coupled with effective enforcement, is crucial. 3. Cultural change. Promoting gender sensitivity training and fostering an environment where women feel safe to report misconduct without fear of retaliation are essential steps. 4. Regional cooperation. African nations should collaborate to share best practices, support victims, and hold perpetrators accountable, creating a unified front against gender-based violence in politics. Recent developments. As of March 10, 2025, legal proceedings concerning Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan's suspension are ongoing. The Federal High Court in Abuja has adjourned the hearing of her lawsuit against Senate President Akpabio, with the next session scheduled for March 25, 2025. The case continues to attract national and international attention, serving as a litmus test for Nigeria's commitment to addressing gender-based violence and promoting a fair political environment. The suspension of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan, set against the backdrop of her sexual assault allegations, serves as a poignant reminder of the challenges women face in African politics. It calls for introspection and concerted efforts to reform political institutions, legal systems, and societal attitudes to ensure a safer and more equitable political landscape for all. Political implications for gender equality and representation. The suspension of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan has not only ignited debates about gender equality within Nigerian politics, but also raises fundamental questions about women's representation in African legislative bodies. The Nigerian Senate, with only 4 women out of 109 seats, reflects the broader gender imbalance that permeates many African political systems. While some African countries have made strides toward improving female representation, others still grapple with deeply entrenched patriarchal systems that limit women's voices in decision-making processes. In Rwanda, for instance, women occupy 61% of the seats in the lower house of parliament, a remarkable achievement that has earned the country global recognition for its gender-inclusive politics. The Rwandan government has implemented policies to support female political participation, including quotas and affirmative action. These measures have resulted in tangible improvements in the visibility and influence of women in national politics. In contrast, Nigeria's political landscape remains challenging for women. The gender quota system, which mandates a minimum representation of women in elected positions, has not been fully enforced, and women still face significant barriers, including limited access to political resources, societal expectations, and gender-based violence. Comparing Nigeria's political challenges to other African nations beyond Nigeria, other African nations have faced similar challenges with sexual harassment and gender-based violence in political settings. In South Africa, the Chak or Total Shutdown movement, which began in 2018, was a response to the widespread sexual harassment and violence faced by women in public spaces, including politics. The movement led to a national conversation about accountability and the need for more stringent measures against sexual harassment in all spheres of life, including in the political arena. The movement's impact was felt in multiple sectors, pushing for the establishment of stronger legal frameworks to address gender-based violence. Similarly, the Ugandan political system has been marred by incidents of gender-based violence, with women leaders like Stella Nyanzi using social media platforms to call attention to sexual harassment within Uganda's political circles. Nyanzi's outspoken activism highlighted the systemic issues women face in politics, despite increasing female political representation. While Uganda has made progress in terms of gender parity in its legislature, including a 35% representation of women in parliament, the country still struggles with ensuring the safety and dignity of its female politicians. Looking toward institutional reform, a call for gender sensitivity. The ongoing situation with Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan is not merely an isolated event, but part of a larger structural issue across the African continent: the exclusion and marginalization of women in politics. To address these challenges, there must be a comprehensive, continent-wide effort to overhaul the systems that perpetuate gender-based violence and discrimination. This involves not only the implementation of quotas, but also a re-examination of the values that underlie African politics, with a shift toward true gender equity. Efforts should include the following steps. 1. Legislative reform. African countries must strengthen their legislative frameworks to explicitly outlaw sexual harassment in all sectors, especially politics. A uniform regional law aimed at protecting female politicians would help create safer political spaces. Enforcement of these laws must be non-negotiable, with the establishment of independent bodies to handle complaints. 2. Political party reforms. Political parties play a crucial role in supporting female politicians. Ensuring that party structures are free from sexism and harassment is vital. Political parties should actively promote gender-inclusive policies and provide mentorship programs for female candidates. Additionally, political parties must be held accountable for the treatment of their female members. 3. Cultural and societal change. In many African societies, political roles are still seen as the domain of men, and women are often discouraged from engaging in politics. Programs aimed at educating the public about the importance of female political participation can help shift societal attitudes. Social media platforms, where many young Africans are increasingly engaging with political discourse, can be powerful tools for changing public perceptions and creating a more inclusive political environment. 4. International collaboration and accountability. African nations should work closely with international organizations such as the African Union, AU, the United Nations, UN, and various human rights NGOs to create a shared framework for addressing gender-based violence in politics. By holding governments accountable on the international stage, African nations can be encouraged to adopt best practices and ensure that women are not subjected to violence or abuse in the political realm. Recent developments, international response and calls for action. The international community has expressed solidarity with Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan, with several global women's rights organizations calling for justice. The United Nations Women's Fund, through its regional office in West Africa, has condemned the suspension, arguing that it sets a dangerous precedent for women in leadership positions. It has urged the Nigerian Senate to reconsider its decision and ensure that the investigation into Akpoti-Uduaghan's allegations is conducted impartially and transparently. In addition to international condemnation, domestic advocacy groups are stepping up their efforts to address the broader issues at play. The Chark Bring Back Our Girls campaign, which began in Nigeria and drew global attention to the kidnapping of schoolgirls by Boko Haram, has now expanded its focus to include the protection of female politicians. The group is calling for a national dialogue on gender equality and the protection of women in political leadership. The role of media and social media in shaping the narrative. The media, both traditional and digital, has played a pivotal role in amplifying the voices of those who have been marginalized within the political process. In the case of Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan, social media platforms have served as an outlet for the voices of outraged Nigerian women who have rallied around her case and used hashtags like #HousJusticeForAkpoti to demand accountability. These social media movements not only bring attention to individual cases, but also contribute to the larger discourse surrounding gender equality and justice in African politics. On the other hand, the Nigerian media's coverage of Akpoti-Uduaghan's suspension has been divisive. Some outlets have championed her cause, portraying the suspension as an attempt to silence a female senator who dared to challenge the status quo. Others have downplayed the severity of the allegations, with some even questioning the timing of her accusations. This polarized media coverage reflects the broader societal debate about gender dynamics in politics and the role of women in governance. A long road ahead. The suspension of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan serves as a stark reminder of the challenges women face in African politics. It is a testament to the persistent gender biases, harassment, and violence that continue to plague political systems across the continent. However, it also provides an opportunity for reflection and reform. The unfolding legal and political battle surrounding her case is likely to have far-reaching implications for women's rights in Nigeria and beyond. As we continue to track the developments in this case, it is crucial for African leaders, civil society organizations, and international partners to push for a system where gender equality in politics is not just a distant aspiration, but a reality. This moment in Nigerian politics could mark the beginning of significant change if there is enough momentum for reform, coupled with a deep commitment to ensuring that all women, regardless of their political affiliations, have a safe and equal space in the political arena. A call to action, the need for institutional accountability. As the legal proceedings surrounding Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan's suspension continue, the larger question remains: how can African political institutions begin to take serious action against gender-based violence and ensure greater inclusivity for women in politics? There is a pressing need for institutional accountability to address the deep-rooted gender disparities that plague political systems across the continent. One area that warrants urgent attention is the treatment of female politicians within legislative bodies. In Nigeria, the Senate's handling of Akpoti-Uduaghan's accusations of sexual assault exposes the broader issue of institutionalized sexism. Although the Senate has established an ethics committee, the lack of accountability in dealing with accusations of sexual misconduct demonstrates the inadequacy of existing mechanisms. Many of Africa's political institutions suffer from similar gaps in how they handle sexual harassment claims, often brushing them aside or silencing the victims. This issue isn't just a Nigerian problem, it spans many African nations. Countries such as Kenya, South Africa, and Uganda have seen similar issues arise, where allegations of sexual harassment by political figures are often ignored, leading to disillusionment among women in politics. For example, in Kenya, female politicians have reported incidents of sexual harassment, but have often found their complaints disregarded by male-dominated parliamentary bodies. The National Assembly's Gender Committee has worked to address such complaints, but the broader issue persists. This highlights the need for comprehensive reforms in all African parliaments to protect women from such abuse. A regional effort, Pan-African collaboration for gender justice. The suspension of Akpoti-Uduaghan represents an opportunity for Pan-African collaboration on gender justice and political reform. African countries can draw on the successes of nations like Rwanda and Senegal, which have not only implemented gender quotas, but have also prioritized the protection and advancement of women in politics. African Union, AU initiatives such as the African Women's Decade, 2010, 2020, and the recently launched 50-50 campaign aim to encourage gender parity in political participation. However, for these efforts to succeed, there needs to be an enforcement mechanism to ensure that countries uphold their commitments to gender equality. For example, the African Union's Solemn Declaration on Gender Equality in Africa, adopted in 2004, laid the groundwork for improving the political and socio-economic status of women across the continent. Yet, as seen with Akpoti-Uduaghan's suspension, the implementation of these goals remains uneven. The lack of enforceable sanctions and the reluctance of some African governments to fully commit to gender parity have hindered progress. A more effective approach would involve not just setting targets, but ensuring accountability through both legal and political channels. The Pan-African Parliament, PAP, which has the potential to advocate for stronger gender-inclusive policies, could play a more prominent role in pushing for systemic reforms across the continent. By advocating for stronger legal frameworks to combat sexual harassment and gender violence, the PAP could help create a more uniform approach to gender equity in African politics. The role of international partners, support and pressure for reform international organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank, alongside civil society groups, have an important role to play in pushing for reforms in African political institutions. These international partners can support gender justice initiatives by providing technical assistance, funding for women's leadership programs, and by pressuring African governments to adhere to their international commitments. For instance, UN Women has consistently called for greater female political participation across Africa, citing evidence that countries with higher female representation in politics tend to have better governance outcomes. The international community must maintain pressure on African nations to ensure that female politicians can serve without fear of harassment or discrimination. Additionally, institutions like the African Development Bank, AFDB, could enhance their focus on gender equality in the projects they fund. By making gender equity a priority in their investments, they could help foster an environment where women are more likely to succeed in politics, business, and other leadership roles. Public opinion and civil society's role in holding leaders accountable. The role of civil society in holding African political leaders accountable cannot be overstated. The strength of social media campaigns like Talk Justice for Akpoti demonstrates the power of public opinion in influencing the direction of political discourse. These movements can create a public demand for accountability, pressuring political institutions to act more fairly and equitably. Women's rights groups, advocacy organizations, and grassroots movements across Africa must continue to mobilize around issues of sexual harassment and gender equality. These groups can serve as a check on political power, holding legislators accountable for their actions and ensuring that the needs of marginalized communities are met. Civil society should continue to highlight incidents of gender-based violence in politics, using public platforms to push for systemic changes that will benefit future generations of African women leaders. One example of the power of civil society is seen in Liberia, where the role of women in the 2005 elections was pivotal in electing the first female president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. The election signified the power of collective action by women, but also underscored the need for ongoing vigilance to protect women's rights and ensure political spaces are free from harassment. Since the election, Liberia has made strides in increasing female participation in politics, though challenges remain, especially regarding the safety and security of female politicians. The continued advocacy by groups such as the Liberia Women's Media Action Committee, LIWOMAC, demonstrates the importance of civil society's role in creating sustainable political reform, paving the way for a more just and equitable Africa. The unfolding case of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan's suspension serves as a critical moment in Nigeria's and Africa's political landscape. It highlights the ongoing struggles women face in accessing and navigating political power, while also serving as a catalyst for much-needed reforms. While the events surrounding Akpoti-Uduaghan's suspension are undoubtedly contentious, they present an opportunity for Africa to confront the systemic issues that hinder women's political participation. Moving forward, African governments, legislative bodies, and civil society groups must work together to create a political environment that ensures women's safety, dignity, and equal opportunity in leadership. Continued engagement from the international community, strong leadership from African political institutions, and sustained pressure from civil society movements will be necessary to dismantle the barriers that prevent women from fully participating in the political process. For the sake of Africa's future, a fairer, safer, and more inclusive political environment is imperative, one where women like Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan no longer must fight for their voices to be heard. Political accountability and the struggle for gender equality. As the legal proceedings and public debates surrounding the suspension of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan continue, the broader struggle for gender equality in African politics faces a crucial juncture. The suspension and the allegations that prompted it shed light on the institutional challenges women face when navigating the political arena, not just in Nigeria, but across the African continent. To address these challenges, political accountability becomes paramount. In many African countries, gender-based violence and harassment in politics remain widespread issues. Despite international frameworks like the African Union's Solemn Declaration on Gender Equality in Africa, which was meant to encourage equal political representation and address gender-based violence, the enforcement of these policies remains a challenge. The Nigerian case exemplifies the continuing struggle to secure an environment where women can thrive politically without the threat of violence or harassment. While the suspension of Akpoti-Uduaghan may seem like an isolated incident, it is symptomatic of a larger, deeply embedded issue in African political institutions. In countries such as Zimbabwe, where women have faced similar challenges in politics, the state apparatus has often overlooked allegations of sexual misconduct involving powerful political figures. For instance, in 2018, allegations of sexual harassment were raised by female political figures against high-ranking members of the Zimbabwean government. But these claims were largely ignored by the ruling party. This impunity reflects a larger pattern across the continent, where political elites are rarely held accountable for abuses of power. A broader regional issue: gender-based violence in politics. In addition to Nigeria, other countries across Africa are grappling with the intersection of gender inequality and political violence. For instance, in South Sudan, female politicians have faced physical threats and harassment from male colleagues, and some have even been silenced for speaking out about corruption or abuses of power. Similar issues are present in Liberia and Sierra Leone, where women in politics often face threats from both political allies and opponents. The situation is exacerbated by the lack of independent mechanisms to address complaints of sexual harassment in many African political systems. In some countries, the legislature is directly involved in investigating allegations of misconduct, which can lead to biased investigations that favor powerful individuals. The absence of transparent and independent bodies to investigate harassment claims further perpetuates a culture of impunity. In the case of Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan, the Senate's Ethics Committee rejected her claims based on procedural violations rather than addressing the merits of her accusations. This response reinforces the perception that institutions are more concerned with protecting powerful figures rather than ensuring justice for women who face violence and discrimination. Consequently, calls for independent oversight bodies to investigate such allegations have become more pronounced. The role of international support and external pressure. In the wake of Akpoti-Uduaghan's suspension, global attention has been drawn to the situation. International bodies such as the United Nations, alongside human rights organizations, have issued statements calling for justice and accountability. The United Nations Women's Fund has specifically called on the Nigerian Senate to reconsider its decision and to ensure a fair and impartial investigation into the allegations. International pressure can play a pivotal role in encouraging African governments to take stronger stances against gender-based violence in politics. Global advocacy, coupled with coordinated efforts from human rights organizations, can create a robust framework to hold African political institutions accountable for their treatment of women. The case of Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan is an opportunity for international actors to support local civil society movements and pressure Nigerian authorities to set a precedent for handling gender-based violence in politics. Moreover, the involvement of the international community could lead to the creation of partnerships with African countries to help enforce gender-sensitive policies and practices across governmental institutions. Countries like Rwanda and Senegal, with their progressive policies on gender equality, could provide valuable lessons in transforming their political systems into safer environments for women. Social media and grassroots mobilization, a key factor in change. Social media has emerged as a powerful tool for raising awareness and mobilizing support for victims of gender-based violence in politics. In the case of Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan, social media platforms have become a battleground for both support and criticism. Nigerian women, along with supporters across the world, have used hashtags such as #Justice for Akpoti to express their anger and demand accountability from the Senate. The power of social media cannot be understated. Movements like Thupwing's Me Too have shown how online platforms can mobilize millions of voices against sexual harassment and violence, bringing attention to the systemic nature of these issues. In Africa, social media campaigns can also amplify the voices of women who may otherwise have been silenced by powerful political figures. These digital platforms provide a space for women to share their experiences, organize protests, and hold politicians accountable in ways that were not possible before. The strength of social media activism was evident in the Park Bring Back Our Girls movement, which pushed the Nigerian government to respond to the Boko Haram kidnapping of more than 200 schoolgirls in 2014. Similarly, the power of social media in the current case of Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan highlights its potential to hold institutions accountable and demand justice for women. Building alliances. A path forward for women's political empowerment. The fight for gender equality in African politics is a collective effort that requires strong alliances between women's rights organizations, civil society groups, political leaders, and international partners. This collective effort can create a groundswell of support that forces political institutions to implement meaningful changes. For example, women's movements across Africa, including in Kenya and South Africa, have formed alliances with human rights organizations, the media, and political parties to push for gender-sensitive reforms. These movements have advocated for policies that promote women's political participation, improve security for female politicians, and create safer spaces for women in the political process. By strengthening these alliances, there is greater potential to advocate for legislative changes that address harassment, gender-based violence, and the marginalization of women. In the case of Akpoti-Uduaghan, the Nigerian Senate's response to public outcry will likely set a precedent for how gender violence cases are handled in the future. If the political elite fails to address the allegations seriously and transparently, it could further erode trust in Nigerian democratic institutions. On the other hand, if the Senate takes steps to address the issue, it could become a model for other African nations grappling with similar issues. The long road to gender equality in politics. The ongoing case of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan underscores the systemic challenges African women face in politics, whether through harassment, gender-based violence, or institutionalized sexism. Female politicians across the continent often encounter significant barriers. The case serves as a wake-up call for African governments and institutions to implement comprehensive reforms that promote gender equality and ensure the safety and dignity of all politicians, regardless of their gender. As we await the next steps in this case, it is crucial for African nations to take proactive measures to foster an inclusive and safe political environment. These efforts will require sustained advocacy from civil society, support from international partners, and a commitment from African leaders to implement policies that genuinely promote gender equality. With enough momentum, the suspension of Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan could become a pivotal moment in the fight for women's rights in Africa, marking the beginning of a broader transformation toward gender justice in African politics, institutional reforms, and the path to true gender equality. To move forward, African nations must take meaningful steps toward institutional reforms that can create a safer and more equitable political landscape for women. For these reforms to be truly effective, they must go beyond symbolic gestures and address the structural inequalities that have long impeded women's full participation in political life. To make this shift, African parliaments must first acknowledge the prevalence of sexual harassment and gender-based violence within their institutions. This requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the power dynamics at play, particularly the ways in which male-dominated political spaces often create environments where women's voices are marginalized and their complaints are ignored. Transparent reporting mechanisms and independent bodies to handle harassment cases must be established to ensure that allegations are addressed fairly and without bias. Moreover, training and education on gender equality must be prioritized within political institutions. Politicians, both male and female, must undergo regular sensitivity training to understand the pervasive effects of gender-based violence and harassment. In many cases, the root of these issues stems from entrenched attitudes about gender roles, which, if left unchallenged, continue to perpetuate unequal treatment. legislative bodies can use their platforms to foster a culture of respect, collaboration, and equality, making it clear that the political space is one where all individuals, regardless of gender, should feel safe and valued. One significant example of how institutions can enact change is seen in Rwanda, which has developed a model for gender-sensitive political structures. Rwanda's parliament is the most gender-represented in the world, with women making up over 60% of the seats in the lower house. This achievement is not a result of mere quotas, but of a concerted effort by the Rwandan government to support women's empowerment through targeted education, access to resources, and protection against violence. While Rwanda's success should not be viewed as a one-size-fits-all solution, it provides a compelling case for how systemic reforms can lead to more inclusive and representative political systems. By emulating Rwanda's success, other African countries can begin to create legislative environments where gender equality is prioritized and where women can thrive as political leaders without fear of retribution or violence. A call for stronger legal frameworks and enforcement. The effectiveness of reforms, however, hinges on the establishment of stronger legal frameworks that protect women from harassment and violence. Across Africa, laws protecting women from sexual harassment, both in the workplace and in political environments, are often weak or poorly enforced. In many cases, political figures who are accused of misconduct are shielded by their status and power, rendering the legal process ineffective. For example, in South Africa, although laws around sexual harassment are in place, the enforcement of these laws has often been inconsistent, especially when it comes to high-profile political figures. While the Adiak's total shutdown movement has garnered attention for its calls for action against gender violence, real legal accountability has been slow to materialize. The lack of a robust legal mechanism to protect female politicians from sexual harassment means that many women continue to face threats to their safety and careers without recourse. To change this, African governments need to pass and enforce comprehensive anti-harassment laws that specifically address the unique challenges faced by women in politics. This should include the creation of clear legal pathways for victims to report harassment, as well as penalties for political leaders who engage in misconduct. Additionally, a regional framework for addressing gender-based violence in politics, with input from African Union, AU member states, would ensure that women have consistent protection regardless of the country in which they operate. Promoting women's political leadership through mentorship and support. As part of the broader effort to ensure women's active participation in political life, there needs to be a focus on mentorship and support structures that empower women to ascend to leadership roles. In many African countries, women are often underrepresented in decision-making positions, and the lack of female role models can discourage younger generations from entering politics. Mentorship programs that pair aspiring female politicians with experienced leaders can be an effective tool in helping women navigate the complexities of political life. These programs provide the guidance and support necessary to overcome the unique challenges women face, such as balancing political responsibilities with societal expectations, managing gender-based attacks, and gaining political leverage in male-dominated spaces. One potential avenue for such programs is the African Women's Leadership Network, AWLN, which aims to build a network of women leaders across the continent who can support one another and work collectively toward gender equity in politics. Through mentorship and collaboration, women politicians can foster a sense of solidarity and empowerment, ensuring that they are not alone in their struggle for justice and representation. Public opinion and media's role in shaping political culture. The role of public opinion cannot be underestimated in advancing gender equality in politics. Media outlets play a significant part in shaping the cultural norms around women's political participation and in holding political leaders accountable for their actions. In the case of Akpoti-Uduaghan, the media's coverage of her suspension and the allegations of sexual harassment brought these issues into the public spotlight, allowing for national and international discussions on the treatment of women in politics. African media, both traditional and social, can serve as a powerful force for change by raising awareness about gender-based violence in political spaces and pushing for systemic reform. The Justice for Akpoti movement, fueled largely by social media, demonstrates how grassroots mobilization can demand political accountability and force governments to address critical issues. Media campaigns that highlight successful female political leaders, as well as the challenges they face, can inspire future generations of women to enter politics and push for change. In many African countries, however, media coverage of gender-based violence in politics is often sensationalized, and women who speak out are sometimes blamed or vilified. For example, in the case of Jennifer Ferguson in South Africa, the media coverage of her rape allegations against Danny Jordan was initially overshadowed by public disbelief and hostility toward her. The negative portrayal of women who come forward with allegations of sexual violence reflects a broader societal reluctance to take women seriously, especially when the accused are powerful men. To combat this, media outlets must take an active role in championing the voices of women and ensuring that allegations of gender-based violence are covered with the seriousness they deserve. International collaboration and support for African women's political movements. Finally, the international community has an important role to play in supporting African women's political movements. Organizations like UN Women, the World Bank, and the African Union can provide technical assistance, financial resources, and political support to help build safer, more inclusive political spaces for women across the continent. Through their work, these organizations can help African nations develop and implement comprehensive gender equality policies, provide training for lawmakers and political leaders, and push for the enforcement of anti-harassment laws. International solidarity, however, should not just focus on providing support from the outside, but should also encourage African governments to prioritize women's rights within their domestic policy frameworks. Global advocacy efforts should press for the inclusion of gender equality in national development agendas and for the implementation of clear, measurable goals to ensure that women's voices are heard at every level of government. A vision for the future. As the case of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan continues to unfold, it represents a critical moment for both Nigeria and the broader African continent in the fight for gender equality in politics. This case underscores the urgent need for reform, not just in terms of legal frameworks, but also within the political culture itself. If African nations are to truly embrace the ideals of democracy, justice, and equality, they must address the gender-based violence and discrimination that continue to undermine the integrity of their political systems. The road ahead is long, but through collective action from civil society, the media, international partners, and political leaders, Africa can build a future where women can participate freely and fully in the political process, unburdened by fear or violence. Only through this collective effort will African countries realize the potential of a truly inclusive and just political system, one where women are not just seen as participants, but as leaders shaping the future of their nations. Engaging African leaders in reform, a call for commitment. The path to gender equality in politics requires not only reforms within political institutions, but also a deeper commitment from African leaders. Political leaders play a pivotal role in setting the tone for political culture and public attitudes toward women in leadership positions. African heads of state, legislators, and government officials must lead by example, ensuring that their actions align with the promises of gender equality and human rights. For many African leaders, gender equality in politics remains an ideal rather than a concrete objective. While some have made strides in advancing women's rights, others have been slow to acknowledge the critical role women can play in political leadership. To move the needle forward, there needs to be a clear, unwavering commitment from African leaders to create an environment where women are free to enter politics without fear of harassment or retaliation. In some countries, like Senegal, political leadership has set a strong precedent for gender equality. Senegal's constitutional reform in 2012 introduced a gender parity law that mandates equal representation of women and men in government positions. The law's implementation was pivotal in increasing the number of women in political roles and has had a lasting impact on public attitudes toward gender representation. For leaders across the continent to achieve similar outcomes, they must actively support and enforce such policies and demonstrate a commitment to breaking down the barriers that hinder women's participation. Education and empowerment as pillars of change. Education is one of the most powerful tools for achieving gender equality, and it must be prioritized in efforts to empower women in African politics. Female political leaders in many African countries have been outspoken about the challenges they faced in their early careers, including a lack of mentorship, limited access to educational resources, and societal expectations that placed a lower value on their political aspirations. Empowering young women through education and political training can help level the playing field. In many African countries, programs aimed at educating and mentoring future female leaders are still in their infancy. There is a pressing need for governments, civil society, and international organizations to invest in such programs on a scale. These programs should focus on developing women's political acumen, improving their public speaking and negotiation skills, and providing them with the necessary tools to navigate the political landscape. Moreover, formal political education must be integrated into the school system to ensure that young girls understand the importance of political participation and the pathways to leadership. Offering programs that teach about women's history in politics, as well as the challenges and successes of female leaders, can inspire young girls to dream big and pursue careers in public service. Early education about gender equality in politics is crucial for the next generation of women leaders. A Pan-African agenda for gender equality. For true progress in addressing gender inequality in African politics, the issue must be elevated to a Pan-African level. African nations must come together to create a unified agenda that prioritizes gender equality, ensuring that progress made in one country can be shared and adopted by others. The African Union, AU, can play an important role by convening member states to set specific targets for women's political participation, funding gender-focused political initiatives, and ensuring that countries adhere to these standards. The AU's African Charter on Human and People's Rights already provides a foundation for promoting gender equality across the continent. However, the AU must do more to ensure that its member states not only sign, but also enforce these commitments. Establishing clear guidelines and timelines for countries to meet gender representation targets in their legislatures and creating a reporting system for progress would help ensure that African countries are held accountable. In addition, fostering dialogue and collaboration between governments, civil society, and regional organizations like the East African Community, EAC, Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and Southern African Development Community, SADC, can help create synergies in efforts to address gender violence in politics. By learning from one another's successes and failures, African countries can collectively push for systemic changes that promote the full participation of women in political life. Role of international institutions in holding African governments accountable. While regional efforts are essential, international bodies must also play a vital role in holding African governments accountable for their gender commitments. The United Nations, along with organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, has the influence and resources to support and monitor African governments' progress toward gender equality in politics. Through their efforts, these organizations can help ensure that African women are given the political space they deserve. International pressure, particularly through economic sanctions and diplomatic channels, can be an effective tool in encouraging governments to uphold their gender commitments. While such measures should be used cautiously, they can act as a powerful motivator for governments that fail to address gender-based violence or uphold women's rights. By aligning international support with political, economic, and diplomatic pressure, a more balanced and equitable approach to gender equality can be achieved. Furthermore, international organizations can play a critical role in facilitating the exchange of ideas, programs, and best practices between African governments. By funding gender-responsive policies and initiatives, International institutions can catalyze local reforms while ensuring that African women in politics are adequately supported. They can also assist in developing independent bodies for investigating and addressing harassment in political spaces, further ensuring that perpetrators are held accountable for their actions. Public engagement and community support. Grassroots movements. Grassroots movements continue to be a cornerstone of social change in Africa, and they will play a central role in driving the reforms needed to eliminate gender-based violence in politics. The collective strength of women's rights organizations, youth movements, and gender equality advocates can help sustain momentum for reform and hold political institutions accountable. In countries like Nigeria, social media has provided a platform for grassroots mobilization, enabling activists to voice their concerns and rally others to join the cause. These movements are not only pivotal in raising awareness, but also in applying pressure on political institutions to act. By amplifying the voices of survivors, activists, and advocates, grassroots movements have the potential to reshape the political landscape, ensuring that the needs and rights of women in politics are met. The success of the Justice for Akpoti movement demonstrates the power of grassroots mobilization, but it also highlights the limitations of such movements without institutional support. If these movements are to achieve long-lasting change, they need to be connected to formal political systems and supported by policymakers who can turn public outrage into action. Building a new political culture. The case of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan is a defining moment in the fight for gender equality in African politics. It underscores the significant challenges that women in politics face and serves as a call to action for reform. From the development of robust legal frameworks to creating educational pathways for aspiring female leaders, Africa has a long way to go in ensuring that women can participate in political life without fear of harassment, violence, or discrimination. The need for institutional, legal, cultural, and regional reforms is clear. For Africa to truly advance on the path to gender equality, governments must prioritize the protection of women in politics, foster political environments that are inclusive and safe, and create pathways for the next generation of women leaders to thrive. Through committed leadership, collaboration, and sustained public pressure, Africa has the potential to build a political culture that values and empowers women. The momentum generated by the suspension of Senator Akpoti-Uduaghan and the ongoing conversations around gender-based violence can be harnessed to create an Africa where women are not just participants, but leaders at the forefront of political transformation. The role of political parties in driving change. Political parties play a critical role in either reinforcing or challenging the gender dynamics within political systems. In many African countries, political parties are still dominated by men, with women being marginalized or sidelined when it comes to leadership positions. For substantial change to take place, political parties must commit to creating inclusive structures that actively encourage the participation of women and work to eliminate barriers that impede their progress. Political parties need to go beyond merely nominating women to meet quotas or comply with gender parity policies. They must create environments where women are supported, respected, and given the resources and space to lead. This includes offering mentorship programs, leadership training, and access to networks that have traditionally been closed off to women. Political parties must also ensure that their internal processes are free from harassment and discrimination, providing women with the confidence that they can progress within the party without fear of being victimized or sidelined. In countries like South Africa and Kenya, some political parties have taken strides to improve gender inclusivity, but there is still much work to be done. The African National Congress, ANC, in South Africa, for example, has a gender parity policy that aims for equal representation of men and women in the party's leadership and political candidates. However, the success of such policies depends on their implementation at the grassroots level. The challenge remains for political parties to foster a culture where women are not just present, but empowered to influence decisions and hold leadership positions within the party. Challenges in implementing gender parity policies. While gender parity laws and policies are essential, the practical implementation often faces significant obstacles. In many African countries, there are still significant cultural and societal barriers that restrict women from fully participating in politics. These barriers include deeply ingrained patriarchal norms, which often prioritize men as political leaders, and the lack of financial resources, which makes it difficult for women to run for office or even campaign effectively. Furthermore, women in politics often face the additional challenge of balancing family and social expectations with their political ambitions. In many African societies, women are expected to fulfill domestic and caregiving roles, which can conflict with the demanding schedules and responsibilities that come with political leadership. As a result, women may find themselves overburdened, making it difficult to maintain the balance between personal, professional, and political responsibilities. Despite these challenges, African women have continued to make significant strides in politics. The case of Rwanda, where women hold the highest percentage of parliamentary seats globally, is a powerful example of how political will, combined with strong gender parity policies, can lead to real change. However, Rwanda's success is an outlier, and for other African countries to replicate this success, they must work to address the broader societal barriers that hinder women's political participation. Creating a gender-responsive legal framework. Another critical area that needs attention is the legal framework surrounding women's rights and gender equality. While many African countries have adopted gender equality policies and legal instruments, the practical application of these laws often falls short. This gap between policy and practice can be attributed to weak enforcement mechanisms, lack of political will, and the persistence of patriarchal norms within legal systems. For example, while Nigeria has laws against sexual harassment and violence, the enforcement of these laws in political spaces remains inadequate. The legal process often fails to provide women with the support and protection they need to pursue justice, particularly when the accused are powerful political figures. Creating a legal environment where women's rights are actively defended requires more than just laws on the books. It demands strong, independent judicial systems, well-trained law enforcement personnel, and political will from leaders to prioritize women's safety and rights. In countries like Senegal, where gender-responsive legal frameworks have been more effectively implemented, there has been a notable increase in the participation of women in politics. This has not only led to higher female representation, but has also contributed to greater national progress in areas such as education, healthcare, and economic development. However, the lessons from Senegal and similar countries must be adopted and adapted across the African continent to create legal systems that protect women in all spheres of life, including politics. The intersection of gender, politics, and social media. In recent years, social media has become a powerful tool for women's advocacy, providing a platform for raising awareness and mobilizing support. Social media campaigns like Me Too and Justice for Akpoti have played an instrumental role in amplifying the voices of women and bringing attention to the challenges they face in politics. These campaigns not only give women a voice, but also create a space for public dialogue around gender inequality, harassment, and violence. In Africa, where traditional media often fails to give adequate coverage to issues of gender-based violence in politics, social media provides a crucial outlet for advocacy. Women's rights organizations, activists, and ordinary citizens can use platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to call for justice, demand accountability, and challenge the status quo. The ability to share personal stories, organize protests, and engage in discussions around political and social issues has transformed how gender inequality is addressed in African politics. However, social media also presents challenges. Online harassment and trolling are common issues for women who speak out on political matters, particularly when their messages challenge powerful figures. Female politicians, journalists, and activists are often subjected to abuse and threats online, further discouraging them from participating in public discourse. To counter these challenges, it is vital to create online spaces that are safe for women to express themselves without fear of retribution. Governments and tech companies must work together to ensure that social media platforms are not only tools for empowerment, but also safe spaces for women. This could involve stricter regulations on online harassment, better moderation of content, and the implementation of policies that protect women's freedom of speech and expression. The role of the international community in supporting reform. International organizations and donors have a crucial role to play in supporting gender reforms across Africa. These organizations can provide funding, expertise, and advocacy to ensure that gender equality becomes a priority within political institutions. The United Nations Women's Fund, for instance, has been instrumental in supporting gender parity efforts in African countries by offering technical assistance, providing financial resources, and fostering dialogue between governments and civil society. The international community can also support the creation of regional coalitions to address gender-based violence in politics. For instance, regional bodies like the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the Southern African Development Community, SADC, can work together to develop policies and guidelines for ensuring women's safety and representation in politics. By fostering collaboration across borders, African countries can share best practices, support each other in their gender equality efforts, and create a more unified and powerful voice for women's rights across the continent. In addition to supporting political reforms, the international community can help African countries build the infrastructure needed to implement these changes. This includes providing funding for gender-sensitive political training programs, supporting campaigns that raise awareness about sexual harassment and violence, and helping to establish independent oversight bodies to investigate and hold accountable those who perpetuate gender-based violence in political spaces. Moving towards an inclusive future. The challenges faced by Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan and the broader issue of gender inequality in African politics highlight the urgent need for reform at every level of society. From institutional changes within political parties to the development of stronger legal frameworks, Africa must prioritize the safety, dignity, and empowerment of women in politics. Only through sustained action from governments, civil society, and the international community can Africa create a political environment where women are free to participate without fear of harassment, violence, or discrimination. The future of African politics depends on the full inclusion of women. By fostering political systems that are gender responsive, promoting leadership development among women, and ensuring that harassment is no longer tolerated, Africa can build a political landscape that reflects the true diversity of its people. The momentum generated by movements like Justice for Akpoti can serve as a catalyst for change, ultimately leading to a more just, equitable, and inclusive Africa for all. A new political era, strengthening institutions for gender equality. The road to gender equality in African politics is long, but the momentum generated by cases like that of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan's suspension presents an opportunity for serious reform. For any progress to be sustainable, it is imperative that African political institutions strengthen their structures to be truly inclusive and supportive of women. Political institutions, particularly parliaments, need to undergo deep structural changes that prioritize gender equality. This means revisiting parliamentary rules, introducing gender-inclusive policies, and ensuring that there are clear protocols for dealing with allegations of sexual harassment and violence. Furthermore, there needs to be a clear demarcation between political disagreements and personal attacks. Allegations of harassment, especially in the cases of powerful figures, should not be swept under the rug or used as tools to discredit those who speak out. This requires the establishment of independent bodies within legislative institutions, tasked with investigating all harassment claims in a transparent and impartial manner. These bodies would provide victims with a space to report misconduct without fear of retaliation, and their findings would be made public to ensure accountability. The credibility of such bodies is crucial to ensuring trust in the political system. Without them, claims of harassment will continue to be brushed aside, and the cycle of abuse will persist. For this to work, African parliaments must undergo a cultural transformation. Politicians, particularly male legislators, must be trained to understand the importance of gender equality, respect for women, and the need to actively fight against harassment in all its forms. A concerted effort to change the political culture from one of gender exclusion to one of equality and respect is critical. Challenges to political will, the struggle for accountability. One of the biggest challenges facing African political institutions is the lack of political will to effect real change. While many African governments have signed international conventions and agreements that call for gender equality, enforcement has been sporadic at best. In some cases, political leaders who are guilty of sexual harassment or abuse are shielded by their power, leading to a culture of impunity. In some African nations, political leaders often view women's rights as a low priority compared to economic or security concerns. The belief that sexual harassment and gender-based violence are private matters, not political ones, is widespread. For reforms to take hold, there needs to be a shift in how leaders view gender issues. Gender equality should not be seen as a peripheral issue, but as central to the stability and growth of the nation. A shift in political will is possible, but it requires strong leadership and a change in attitudes. Women leaders, civil society organizations, and international partners must continue to pressure African governments to hold accountable those who perpetuate violence and discrimination. Political parties must also make gender equality a priority, ensuring that policies aimed at empowering women are implemented across all levels of government. Countries like South Africa, which has made significant progress in addressing gender inequality through strong legislation and political commitment, offer valuable lessons. Their example shows that with strong leadership and public pressure, change is possible. The continued push for greater female representation in South African politics has had a positive impact on both women's rights and governance. In countries where gender issues are still marginalized, similar efforts are needed to raise the importance of women's safety and rights in political spaces. The role of the private sector and civil society in political reform. While governments play a significant role in shaping political reforms, civil society and the private sector are crucial to driving change at the grassroots level. In many African countries, women's rights organizations and activists are the first to speak out against injustice, organize protests, and demand accountability. These organizations must continue to lead the charge, but they also need broader support from the private sector, international organizations, and even the media. Private companies, particularly multinational corporations, have a responsibility to help shape a more gender-inclusive political landscape. They can do this by investing in gender equality initiatives, supporting female political candidates, and advocating for policies that protect women. This could include providing funding for women's campaigns, offering training programs for female politicians, and investing in female political leadership development programs. Moreover, media organizations have a significant influence in shaping public attitudes toward gender issues. The media should use its platform to raise awareness about the challenges women face in politics and highlight the work of women leaders. Positive media coverage can inspire young girls to aspire to leadership roles and challenge the traditional notions of who is fit to lead. The media also plays a critical role in ensuring that harassment cases and gender inequality issues remain in the public eye. Investigative journalists can uncover instances of misconduct and harassment, exposing them for the public to demand accountability. However, the media must do so responsibly, ensuring that its coverage is fair and does not further perpetuate the victimization of women who have already been harmed. Engaging men in the fight for gender equality. One of the most significant barriers to gender equality in African politics is the ongoing challenge of engaging men in the fight for women's rights. In many African countries, men still hold most of the political power, and it is crucial to ensure they are part of the solution, not the problem. Men must be seen as allies in the fight against sexual harassment and gender-based violence. Gender equality cannot be achieved without the active participation of men in the political process. Men need to take on the responsibility of addressing their own biases, supporting female candidates, and helping to create policies that protect women from violence. They must also hold their male colleagues accountable when they engage in misconduct. Encouraging men to speak out against sexual harassment, both publicly and within their own circles, can help reduce the stigma around these issues and create a more supportive environment for women. Involving men in these conversations is particularly important in African communities where traditional gender roles are deeply entrenched. By working with men and educating them about the benefits of gender equality, it is possible to create a coalition of both men and women who work together to break down barriers and ensure women's rights are respected in all spheres of society, including politics. The importance of global solidarity in advancing women's rights. The fight for gender equality in African politics is not an isolated one. It is part of a broader global movement for women's rights and justice. International solidarity is crucial for advancing women's rights in Africa and ensuring that reforms take root. The global community must continue to support women's rights initiatives, provide funding for women's leadership development, and pressure governments to uphold international commitments to gender equality. Countries like Canada, Norway, and the Netherlands, which have a long history of supporting gender equality, can play a significant role in this process. By providing financial support and diplomatic pressure, these nations can help create an environment in which women are safe and empowered to participate fully in political life. Additionally, international human rights organizations can help create frameworks for accountability. By working with African governments to adopt international standards for gender equality and gender-based violence, these organizations can help push for real, lasting change. Holding governments accountable through international treaties and agreements sends a powerful message that gender equality is not negotiable. The path forward. The case of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan, while painful, provides a critical opportunity for reflection, reform, and progress. It serves as a stark reminder of the obstacles women face in politics, but also highlights the potential for change. By committing to institutional reforms, strengthening legal frameworks, and engaging both men and women in the fight for gender equality, African countries can create political environments where women are not just participants, but leaders who shape the future of their nations. To make this vision a reality, African governments must show leadership, civil society must continue to raise its voice, and international partners must support these efforts. Gender equality in politics is not just a women's issue. It is a fundamental human rights issue that affects the progress, stability, and development of entire nations. It is time for Africa to take bold steps toward a more inclusive and just political future for all its citizens, regardless of gender. Sustaining momentum, ensuring long-term change. While the momentum sparked by high-profile cases like that of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan's suspension has been crucial, sustaining this momentum for long-term change is essential. Real progress on gender equality in politics requires ongoing commitment from all sectors of society, including political leaders, civil society organizations, the private sector, the media, and the international community. The goal is not just to address individual cases of harassment or discrimination, but to fundamentally alter the structures and systems that have perpetuated gender inequality in political spaces. To sustain momentum, it is critical to focus on both short-term actions and long-term strategies. Short-term actions might include holding high-profile offenders accountable, enacting policies that protect women, and creating immediate mechanisms for support and justice. However, these actions must be part of a broader, long-term strategy that includes education, cultural transformation, and structural reforms. In the long term, African countries must work toward the systemic empowerment of women in politics, ensuring that gender equality becomes ingrained in every level of political and social life. These long-term efforts include fostering female political leadership from an early age, providing ongoing education about gender equality, and instilling in future generations of politicians a deep understanding of the need for inclusivity and respect for all. Promoting women's political empowerment at the grassroots level. At the grassroots level, there is a need for targeted initiatives that focus on empowering young women and preparing them to take on leadership roles in their communities and in politics. Many African women, particularly in rural areas, are still underrepresented in political spaces due to a combination of socioeconomic factors, cultural norms, and limited access to education. Creating opportunities for young women to engage in political life early on is critical for ensuring that they have the skills, resources, and confidence to succeed. Youth programs that target girls and young women can provide them with the knowledge and tools they need to become active participants in politics. These programs should include leadership development, financial literacy, public speaking, and negotiation skills. Additionally, mentorship programs that pair young women with established female leaders can help foster a sense of community and solidarity among women in politics. Community-based organizations, local governments, and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, can collaborate to create these programs, ensuring that they are accessible to young women across Africa, especially those from marginalized communities. These programs must be inclusive, ensuring that women from all backgrounds, including those from rural areas, receive the support they need to succeed in political roles. Building inclusive political parties and networks. Another key area for reform is within political parties themselves. Political parties remain the primary vehicles for political participation in most African countries, and they often serve as gatekeepers to political power. However, many political parties still operate under patriarchal systems that prevent women from advancing to leadership positions. For meaningful change to occur, political parties must actively work to include more women in leadership roles and decision-making processes. This can be achieved through the implementation of gender-inclusive party policies, such as establishing gender quotas for party leadership and candidate positions. Political parties should also ensure that women are included in key decision-making bodies within the party, such as campaign committees, policy development groups, and fundraising teams. Ensuring women's equal participation in party structures can help shape political agendas that are more inclusive and reflective of the diverse needs of society. Moreover, political parties can work together to create networks and platforms that allow women to support one another and share resources, knowledge, and strategies. These networks can provide a space for women to collaborate on common issues, amplify their voices, and push for policies that address the specific challenges they face in the political realm. The creation of these women's political networks can be a game changer in terms of fostering solidarity and promoting gender equality within political systems. Reimagining the role of men as allies in the gender equality movement. To truly achieve gender equality in politics, men must be brought into the conversation as allies, advocates, and active participants in the movement for change. In many African countries, gender equality is often framed as a women's issue, but the reality is that it affects everyone, and it is only through the active participation of men that true societal transformation can occur. Men must recognize that gender equality benefits not only women, but also society, leading to stronger, more stable, and more prosperous communities. Men in political leadership positions have a responsibility to support and advance gender equality by ensuring that the policies and practices they enact are inclusive. Men can also act as mentors to women entering politics, helping to create pathways for their success and ensuring that they are not held back by the biases and barriers that have historically limited their political participation. Furthermore, men can take on leadership roles in combating harassment and violence against women in politics, making it clear that such behavior will not be tolerated. Education is key to engaging men in the gender equality movement. By incorporating gender equality into educational curricula and offering workshops that address the importance of respect, inclusivity, and nonviolence, Men can be taught to recognize and challenge harmful behaviors and attitudes. As men begin to understand the deep-seated cultural and societal biases that have perpetuated gender inequality, they can become more effective allies in the fight for women's rights. Leveraging technology and innovation for political reform. In the digital age, technology and innovation offer new opportunities for advancing gender equality in politics. Social media has already played a significant role in raising awareness and organizing campaigns, as demonstrated by movements like Me Too and Justice for Akpoti. Social media provides a platform for women to share their stories, raise their voices, and demand change, but it also presents challenges in terms of online harassment and abuse. To maximize the potential of technology, African countries must ensure that the digital space is a safe and accessible environment for women. This includes developing policies that address online harassment, providing resources for women to report abuse, and offering digital literacy programs to ensure that women can effectively use technology to advance their political agendas. Additionally, technology can be used to create more transparent and accountable political processes, such as through e-voting systems and platforms for public participation in decision-making. Moreover, technology can be harnessed to facilitate the political empowerment of women by providing them with the tools to organize, campaign, and communicate effectively. Digital platforms can connect female political leaders and activists, creating networks for collaboration, strategy development, and knowledge sharing. As technology continues to evolve, its potential to drive positive change in African politics, particularly for women, becomes even more significant. Global solidarity and collective action for women's rights. As African nations continue their journey toward gender equality in politics, global solidarity remains a powerful force for change. International organizations, donors, and advocates must continue to support and amplify the efforts of African women, ensuring that their struggles and victories are recognized worldwide. Global solidarity helps raise awareness, mobilize resources, and hold African governments accountable for their commitments to gender equality. The global community can support African women in politics by offering funding for women's leadership programs, providing technical expertise, and creating platforms for the exchange of best practices. Additionally, by applying diplomatic pressure and holding governments accountable, international organizations can ensure that the progress made is sustained and that the rights of women in African politics are consistently protected. The future of African politics is gender equal. The fight for gender equality in African politics is an ongoing battle that requires sustained effort from all sectors of society. The case of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan serves as a powerful reminder of the challenges women face in political spaces, but also offers a crucial opportunity for reform. Through the implementation of legal frameworks, political party reforms, education, and global solidarity, Africa can create an environment in which women's voices are heard, respected, and valued. As African countries work toward a future of gender equality, it is essential that they do so with a commitment to creating inclusive, safe, and empowering spaces for women in politics. By breaking down the barriers that hinder women's participation and by fostering a culture of respect and inclusiveness, Africa can build a political system that is truly representative of its diverse population. The transformation of African politics into a more gender-inclusive system will not only benefit women, but will contribute to the long-term prosperity and stability of the continent. Addressing the gender paradox in African politics. A call for revolutionary change. As we continue to look toward a more gender-inclusive future in African politics, it's important to acknowledge the paradox that exists within many African countries. While African women have been making strides in leadership, political participation, and advocacy, they still face a daunting array of barriers that prevent them from achieving true equality. In countries where women hold important positions, such as Rwanda, the success has been exceptional, but it is not reflective of the situation in many other nations across the continent. These disparities are not due to a lack of capability among African women, but rather the deep-rooted systemic and cultural barriers that continue to undermine their political power. African leaders must confront these paradoxes head-on by addressing the structural inequalities within political institutions. While gender parity laws and quotas are a good starting point, they should not be seen as the final solution. There needs to be a commitment to nurturing female leaders at every level of government, from local councils to national parliaments. This means fostering not only an environment where women can participate, but one in which they are actively empowered to lead and make decisions that affect their communities. The importance of leadership commitment and accountability. For progress to be realized, African political leaders must make a tangible commitment to gender equality. Political will at the highest levels is necessary to change entrenched systems and attitudes. Leaders must take personal responsibility for implementing gender-sensitive policies and ensure that these policies are effectively enforced. In doing so, they will set a powerful example for the next generation of political leaders. One of the critical areas of focus should be the creation of gender-inclusive legal frameworks that provide women with the protection, support, and resources needed to thrive politically. African leaders should prioritize the passage of laws that explicitly protect women from harassment and violence, and ensure these laws are actively enforced. Additionally, support for female candidates should go beyond financial resources. It should include mentorship, training, and opportunities for women to build the networks and political capital necessary to succeed in the competitive world of African politics. African leaders must also demonstrate a commitment to tackling the broader issues of economic inequality and access to education, which remain significant barriers for women. By investing in the economic empowerment of women through support for women-owned businesses, access to education, and healthcare, leaders can pave the way for greater political representation and participation. Advice to African leaders. To truly break the cycle of gender inequality in African politics, leaders must prioritize the following. 1. Empower women through policy and action. African leaders must prioritize policies that empower women, ensuring that they are not only represented in politics, but that they have the tools and resources needed to lead effectively. Gender quotas should be enforced but also complemented by strong mentorship and leadership development programs. 2. Combat gender-based violence and harassment. Gender-based violence and harassment must be tackled head-on within political institutions. Leaders should establish independent bodies to investigate complaints of harassment, and they should ensure that those found guilty are held accountable. Women should feel safe in the political space, and policies must be put in place to protect them from retaliation for speaking out. 3. Promote gender equality in education and employment. Leaders must invest in education and employment opportunities for women, particularly in sectors that have historically been male-dominated, such as politics, business, and technology. By leveling the playing field economically, women can access the tools needed to succeed politically. 4. Provide support for women in leadership. Political leaders should ensure that women are given platforms for leadership. This could be achieved by promoting women to senior positions in government, ensuring that they are included in the decision-making process, and encouraging other women to step into leadership roles. 5. Foster cultural change. True gender equality requires a shift in cultural attitudes toward women. African leaders should advocate for cultural reforms that challenge and change the deeply embedded stereotypes about women's roles in politics and society. Changing public perceptions will be vital for breaking the barriers that limit women's full participation in public life. Summary of key messages. The struggle for gender equality in African politics is ongoing, but significant progress is achievable. African women have demonstrated their resilience, leadership, and capability, yet they still face deep-rooted barriers that limit their full participation in political life. The suspension of Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan, while a moment of injustice serves as an important catalyst for reflection and reform. For Africa to truly achieve gender equality in politics, it requires 1. Political will. African leaders must demonstrate genuine commitment to gender equality by reforming political institutions, creating inclusive policies, and holding themselves accountable for progress. 2. Cultural transformation. A shift in cultural attitudes toward women's roles in politics is necessary. Leaders must promote respect, inclusivity, and equality within their parties and public institutions. 3. Legal protection. Gender-based violence and harassment in politics must be eradicated through strong laws, enforcement, and the establishment of independent bodies that can investigate allegations impartially. 4. Empowerment of women. The empowerment of women must go beyond mere representation. It includes providing the resources, networks, and support systems that allow women to excel in leadership roles. 5. Collaboration and support. Both local and international actors must collaborate in supporting African women in politics, ensuring that their voices are amplified and their safety guaranteed. In conclusion, Africa stands at a crossroads. With the right leadership, policies, and support, it is possible to transform the political landscape into one that values and empowers women. The continued advocacy, support, and action from all sectors of society, particularly political leaders, are crucial in creating a more inclusive and just political system. African leaders must act decisively to create a future where women can fully participate in politics without fear of violence, discrimination, or exclusion. Through collective action, Africa can build a political environment where gender equality is not just a dream, but a reality. Thank you for watching this in-depth analysis on the Nigerian woman senator suspended after sexual assault allegation. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the Bold African Voice, BAV, for more insightful discussions on African politics, social justice, and the fight for equality. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How can African nations improve gender equality in politics? Until next time, stay bold and stay informed.